Hello and welcome to this backup presentation for the presentation by me, Charles Nicholson, and co-authors for the ISDC conference in July 2020. So I'll be talking today about using system dynamics models to help us assess the linkages between agriculture and food security. I'm going to focus in this presentation on the household level, although in the paper we talk more about both the household and the regional level. So this presentation has as its objective not the typical system dynamics modeling process where we define a problem and then we think about how we develop a conceptual model for it, a quantitative simulation model, test that model, and then use it for policy analysis. Instead, we are starting from a position of using two existing system dynamics models. And our purpose is to illustrate the usefulness of incorporating certain metrics of food security that are not commonly used into those two existing models and showing the kinds of insights that we expect to be able to get from them. So there's more of a focus on the process of integrating these indicators, documenting, talking about their usefulness, and there's less focus on exactly model evaluation or policy analysis for what we want to do in this purpose. And in this case, we're going to actually talk primarily about a household level model, and that will allow us to focus in on some of these key points. So in case it's helpful to have a little bit of a reminder about food security, there are different definitions of food security, but a common one has been proposed by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and it focuses on four different dimensions. Often the first of these is thought of as availability. Is food physically available? But there are a number of other dimensions that in a sense follow from that, including access, which has multiple different dimensions that you see there, both physically, economically accessible, but also things like culturally acceptable. Often that's looked at more at a household level. And then within a household, once food has been acquired, it's allocated to individuals. And that leads to outcomes such as individual nutrition status that are often referred to by the term utilization. And then one of the other dimensions that is a little bit more difficult to capture is really this idea of stability across time, which implies that for each of these different dimensions of food security, a household or a community or a region or a nation is able to meet certain standards for availability, access, and utilization across time. So there are a number of different concepts here, often challenging to figure out the different linkages. And one of the things that we had done prior to developing this particular paper was to review how agricultural systems models had represented food security outcomes. And this diagram tries to show us a little bit about the complex potential pathways that link agricultural production, which is a focus in a lot of the agricultural systems models and literature, and really has us focusing down here on household, crop, and livestock production. And this actually corresponds more to the availability dimension of food security. Is food physically available? But as you can see from this diagram, which I won't go through in a great deal of detail, we actually have a number of pathways that would link that production to other indicators that are more commonly used to assess food access, which are shown here in the diagram circled in the green. And so a complex systems approach based on system dynamics modeling seems appropriate here to help us to understand these different linkages and to provide a way to show how we might incorporate these different indicators into existing system dynamics models. So again, one of the things we found was in previous analyses using simulation models, and not all of these are system dynamics models, but many of them are dynamic, modelers have focused on availability much more than access or utilization. And that's primarily because a lot of what they are trying to do is predict things like yields and total production, which lends itself more carefully, or more closely, excuse me, to thinking about the availability dimension. Relatively few of the previous modeling studies have tried to think about access or utilization, which for many human nutritionists are the more important measures that we should look at. And in particular, there's also been very limited treatment of the stability dimension in household level models. And so there are few clearly defined metrics in previous systems modeling studies that allow us to say that the stability dimension is being met. And so we wanted to be more explicit about that and show one way in which this could be addressed. So in the basis of our previous review, we recommended a greater focus on indicators of access, which would include food consumption expenditures, how much is the household spending on food. And then also more recently, human nutritionists have developed experiential scales that look at food insecurity from the perspective of the lived experience of a household or individual. And another important element of food security on the access side is dietary diversity. What's the diverse set of foods that households consume, and how frequently do they consume them? So we wanted to focus on incorporating those three indicators, which are viewed as moving beyond availability, into two system dynamics models. And the other dimension, as I mentioned previously, is to incorporate specific stability metrics for dynamic systems, and we do that using the work of Herrera from 2017, which talked about trying to operationalize the analysis of what is referred to in that paper as resilience. And we're going to focus on two particular metrics. One is hardness. Can a system withstand disturbances? And the other is elasticity, and that is if there is a disturbance and the system is moved away from where it would have been otherwise, can the system recover? And so we're going to use that as an alternative metric as well. So the example that I'm going to talk about here of the two that are in the paper, I'm going to focus on the household level model, which is referred to as classes, which is crops, livestock, and soils in smallholder economic systems. This was a bioeconomic SD model of a smallholder farm household in the Kenyan highlands. Includes a number of different agricultural production activities, including maize, cattle, forage crops for the livestock, and tea as a cash crop. It actually has some very important biophysical dimensions to it in that it tracks soil nutrient dynamics and crop yields. It also has economic decision-making in the form of household decision makers allocating their resources dynamically over time to what provides them with the best average return to a significantly limiting constraint in many situations, which is the availability of household labor. And I'm not going to focus on the model evaluation and a lot even of the structure of the model, because this has been previously published and evaluated in the citation that you see there at the bottom of the screen. But as a quick view of what this model does, it has a number of key stocks, one of which is the cash that is available to the household. You can think about this a little bit as a bank account. The number, we can also think about the age, structure, and productivity of livestock is another stock in the model. And another key driver of productivity in this system is the soil organic matter stock. And so this model tries to capture the interactions between crop production, soil nutrient dynamics, livestock production, and cash. And in previous work, we had talked about how this links to a shortfall in the available cash to support consumption of grain, which was one way to think about food security. What we've done is modify this particular model to allow for those other indicators to be incorporated. So how do we do this? Well, one of the things that we did to set up this particular case example was we tried to compare two different households with different levels of resources and characteristics. So household size and the availability of labor is one difference between these two households, for which I'll show you results. We also looked at land area, education levels, and initial levels of cash in that household cash savings stock. We had to modify food consumption decision rules, and there's some discussion of that in detail in the paper. And we also had to adapt some of the relationships linking the model inputs and outputs to the assumptions to represent both the food insecurity experience scale outcomes as well as the household dietary diversity scale outcomes. And in particular, what we wanted to do for the purposes of our stability analysis was to assess the impacts of a 1-year shock that would be 2 maize harvests in the Kenyan context, where there are greatly reduced yields of the maize, which is a staple crop, really important for food security as well as income security. So what I want to do now is show you a few key graphs of some of the results to illustrate the kinds of results that we get when we incorporate these metrics into into this particular system dynamics model. And I've highlighted here on a graph, this is the number of quarters, and the first outcome that we'll look at is food consumption expenditures, one of the indicators of food security. You can see that I've highlighted from quarter 9 to 13 a maize yield shock. And if we look at without the shock, a lower resource household has food consumption expenditures that vary seasonally, and that's a common phenomenon in this particular setting, but slightly trending down initially, but being fairly stable in terms of an average after the initial adjustment processes early on in the simulation. If we impose a shock on this particular household, what we see is, not surprisingly, that their food consumption expenditures are very much affected. They drop to less than half of their previous levels during that period of time where there is the maize shock, but then they also recover. A higher resource household has a similar sort of pattern, starts at a higher level of food consumption expenditures, again, same seasonal variation that is occurring there. But it's affected somewhat differently by the shock. First, it's less affected, and then it sees a fairly rapid decline like the low resource household, but also recovers. So 2 key takeaways that we get from incorporating this metric are that the time pattern actually differs. The low resource household is affected negatively much more quickly, but also to a larger extent, but also that both households ultimately recover and return to something like their previous consumption levels. Okay? So it's the kind of information that this sort of analysis can give us. If we then also look at another indicator of access, which is this food insecurity experience scale, on this scale, a higher value means more food insecurity. So that's what that shows off on the left. And again, the maize shock is shown, maize yield shock is shown from 9 to 13. For the lower resource household with no shock, their pattern of food insecurity experience looks like this. We would consider this a relatively high value. There is some variation even in the absence of a shock. But if there is a shock, actually, interestingly, we see the food insecurity experience scale value going up to values the household has seen previously without a shock, and then subsequently falling down and oscillating, in a sense, between levels that are lower than they would have been otherwise. And we'll talk in a moment about why that is. For the higher resource household with no shock, there is stability in terms of this particular metric when there is no shock. But when there is a shock, this household is also affected, sees an increase in their experience of food insecurity. And in fact, for a brief moment there, right around quarter 12, they and a household that has lower resources are at equal values of this scale, right? They then, after the shock is over, return back to the levels that they were at previously. So one of the reasons that we see the pattern we do for the lower resource household is that they actually make a permanent change in response to this shock to selling more of their labor in the marketplace and buying more of their food from other sources outside their own production, which may sound like a bad thing, but in this case, it actually helps to improve their average level of food insecurity by lowering that value. And that's what we see with those up and down lines starting in quarter 14 in this graph for that lower resource household, okay? So the increase in food insecurity is actually larger for the high resource household, which is different than what we saw when we looked at the food consumption expenditures. But there's a long-term improvement for the low resource household. So these are the kinds of insights that we don't currently get from the kinds of modeling work that has been done, and why provides one reason why it's important to include these sorts of indicators in models, especially system dynamics models. So the last thing I want to talk about is our stability analysis. And the way we do this is we do a stochastic analysis of yield shocks. We vary the amount of yield shock and its duration. do 200 simulation, and in this case, we're going to assess its impacts on food consumption expenditures. What we're going to do is look at the product yield decrease times the duration, and we compare this behavior to the behavior without a shock. And the two metrics that I mentioned earlier, one is hardness, which is the maximum disturbance that an indicator can tolerate before its behavior changes significantly. And in this case, we're looking at a 5% change from existing levels. And the other is elasticity, and this is the maximum disturbance that an indicator can have before it cannot recover to its sort of reference or average value behavior. And what we find in the case for this particular assessment is the system is not very hard. It doesn't take very much of a shock to move that food consumption indicator more than 5% away from its previous value without the shock. The good news is that the elasticity says that, the elasticity analysis says that it can actually return and fairly quickly to its original state. And so the system is not very hard, but it does seem to be elastic. And this is a way of saying that low resource household can be easily affected. It has a low hardness value, but it can also recover. And both of these are important pieces of information that might be relevant for formulating appropriate policies in response to a maize yield shortfall. Okay? And this graph actually just shows what the pattern is and tries to help us assess why we have low hardness yet high elasticity. So there's a large impact here when there is a shock, and this is for the average value that I showed you previously, the average yield loss for the duration of 4 quarters. But we also do see relatively rapid and complete recovery, in fact, to some levels that are higher than they would have been before. So this illustrates graphically the kinds of ideas that we are trying to get at by incorporating these indicators. Okay. So finally, a few concluding comments. Off on the right, I have the diagram that shows the complex set of linkages between agricultural production and other indicators of food security. And I think what we have found in the course of our paper and the analysis for it is that system dynamics modeling can very usefully incorporate improved food security metrics to address these complex linkages and provide insights that we do not get through other mechanisms. And second, as a follow-on to what we have done, it would be important to have greater participatory modeling with the relevant communities, and these can be both the academic communities as well as sort of the communities affected by food security issues, to improve the empirical assessment and to help formulate appropriate policy responses. So with that in mind, that is what I have to say for this. Hope we never need to use this because I'll do it live for the actual presentation. So thank you very much.